A cast iron skillet sat in the back of a chuck wagon outside Abilene, Kansas for 11 years. It belonged to a black trail cook who rode the Chisholm Trail 6 times between 1871 and 1882. He fed 12 men 3 meals a day with nothing but flour, beans, and salt pork. His wages were $30 a month. 1 in 4 cowboys on the American frontier was black. Most of them ate the same 25 meals for years. Number 12 was borrowed from Mexican vaqueros and changed trail cooking forever. Number 7 used parts of a calf that would make a modern American walk away from the table. Number 24 kept men alive on 2 cents a day. These were not recipes. These were acts of survival. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count them down. Number 25, hardtack. This was the food that refused to die. A square of flour, water, and salt baked until every trace of moisture was gone. Union soldiers carried it through the Civil War, and when those same men headed west to work cattle, they brought the habit with them. Black cowboys kept hardtack in their saddlebags for weeks without it spoiling. The Army issued 9 crackers per day to each soldier. Buffalo soldiers stationed at Fort Davis, Texas, lived on these for months at a time. The biscuits were so hard that men called them tooth dullers and worm castles. You soaked them in coffee for 20 minutes just to make them chewable. Some cowboys crumbled hardtack into bacon grease and fried the pieces until golden. 100 crackers cost less than $1 in the 1870s. They tasted like nothing. They kept you alive. That was the only job they had to do, year after year, drive after drive. Number 24, cornmeal mush. This was the meal that crossed the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships and landed in every black kitchen from Virginia to the Texas plains. Cornmeal boiled in water with a pinch of salt until it thickened into a porridge that could be eaten hot or left to cool and sliced and fried the next morning. Enslaved people survived on cornmeal rations for generations. When freedom came and black men rode west to work cattle, they carried that knowledge with them. A 5-pound sack of cornmeal cost 15 cents in 1878 and lasted a single man 2 weeks. You didn't need a recipe. You needed a pot, a fire, and enough patience to stir. Trail cooks made it before dawn and left it on the wagon tailgate for men who had been riding since midnight. It was bland. It was filling. It was the taste of making do when making do was all you had. Generation after generation, cornmeal and water and survival. Number 23, sow belly and beans. Every chuck wagon in Texas carried a barrel of salt pork and a sack of dried beans. The pork was cured belly fat, so heavily salted it had to be soaked in water before you could eat it without your mouth going numb. Black trail cooks sliced it thin and fried it until the edges curled, then used the rendered fat to season. The beans. A pound of sow belly cost 12 cents. A pound of dried pinto beans cost 8. Together they made the backbone of nearly every meal on the Chisholm Trail from 1867 to 1885. Cowboys ate this combination so often they stopped tasting it. They just chewed and swallowed and rode. But the protein and fat kept men in the saddle for 14 hours a day. It wasn't a meal anyone chose. It was a meal that chose you because there was nothing else. Number 22, jerky. When a steer went down on the trail and the cook couldn't use all the meat before it spoiled, he cut the beef into thin strips, rubbed them with salt, and hung them over a line near the campfire smoke. In 2 days, those strips turned into jerky that lasted for months. Black cowboys carried jerky in their coat pockets and chewed it while riding. It was drier, more brittle, and far saltier than anything you would find in a store today. The method came from generations of practice. Enslaved people in the South had dried and smoked meat for their enslavers long before the cattle drives began. That skill traveled west with the men who carried it. A single pound contained enough calories for a full day of work. It required no cooking, no fire, and no time. You tore off a piece with your teeth and kept moving. The frontier did not wait for you to sit down. Number 21, hoe cakes. The name came from the field hoe that enslaved workers used as a cooking surface, holding it over an open flame to bake cornmeal batter into flat, crisp cakes. By the time black cowboys reached the frontier, hoe cakes had become a staple of trail cooking. Cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and a hot skillet. That was the entire recipe. The cook poured the batter into a greased cast iron pan and flipped the cakes when the edges turned brown and pulled away from the sides. Hoe cakes traveled well. You could stack them cold in a cloth and eat them hours later from the saddle. Black cowboys on the goodnight loving trail ate hoe cakes for breakfast and again for supper when the cook didn't have time for anything else. The cakes tasted like the cornbread your grandmother made, only flatter and rougher and cooked over a fire instead of an oven. They were simple. They were honest. That was enough. Number 20, cowboy coffee. If you took away every other item on this list, a black cowboy would survive on coffee alone longer than you might believe. Arbuckle Brothers, out of Pittsburgh, sold pre-roasted coffee beans in 1-pound paper sacks for 20 cents each. Before that, cowboys had to roast green beans in a skillet over the fire, and a single burned bean ruined the whole batch. The trail cook boiled water in a tin pot, threw in a fistful of grounds, and let it boil until the liquid turned the color of river mud. Cowboys drank it black. No sugar, no milk, because there was no sugar or milk within 100 miles. A cup in the morning and another at midnight watch was the only thing separating a man from falling asleep in the saddle. Some cooks added a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. Some threw in an eggshell to settle the grounds. Every cup tasted like survival. Number 19, son of a gun stew. This was the meal that separated the frontier from polite society. When a calf was slaughtered on the trail, the cook used everything: heart, liver, tongue, sweetbreads, brains, and a tube called the marrow gut, which was only edible while the calf was still nursing. Everything was diced and thrown into a Dutch oven with onions, salt, and enough water to cover it. Then it simmered for 3 hours until the organs broke down into a thick, rich stew that tasted nothing like what you would expect. Eastern journalists who visited cattle camps in the 1870s called it barbaric. Cowboys who ate it called it the best meal on the trail. Black trail cooks brought something to this stew that other cooks didn't: the spicing, a dash of chili, pepper, a handful of wild onions pulled from the prairie, the instinct to season food with whatever the land offered, an instinct that came from West African cooking traditions carried across the Atlantic and through generations of forced labor, and finally out onto the open range. Here's what nobody talks about when they talk about cowboy food. 1/4 of the men who drove cattle from Texas to Kansas were black. They did not just ride the trails, they cooked on them. They brought the knowledge of how to make something from nothing, how to turn organs and scraps into a meal that men fought over. That wasn't learned on the frontier. That was carried from plantations in Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, where making a meal from what the enslaver threw away was not a skill, it was a requirement for staying alive. Son of a gun stew was the frontier version of soul food. Nobody called it that, but that is exactly what it was. Number 18, spotted pup. This was the closest thing to dessert a cowboy ever saw on the trail. Rice cooked in water with raisins and a spoonful of sugar, served warm from the Dutch oven after supper. The name came from the way the dark raisins dotted the white rice like the spots on a cattle dog. Chuck wagon cooks made it when morale was low and the men needed something that tasted like comfort instead of necessity. A pound of rice cost 10 cents. A handful of raisins cost about the same. The whole pot fed a dozen men and left them feeling like someone had remembered they were human. Black cowboys on drives out of South Texas ate spotted pup on nights when the cook was in a generous mood. It wasn't fancy. It was not complicated. It was rice and raisins in a pot. But after 2 weeks of nothing but beans and sow belly, it tasted the way a warm bed feels after sleeping on the ground. That kindness kept men going. Number 17, Redeye gravy and biscuits. You fried a slice of cured ham in a skillet. When the ham was done, you poured black coffee directly into the hot pan. The coffee hit the ham drippings and sizzled into a thin, dark gravy with a reddish tint at the center, which is where the name came from. You spooned that gravy over a sourdough biscuit and ate it with your hands. Black cowboys in East Texas grew up on this before they ever saw a trail drive. It was a breakfast their mothers made with whatever meat was in the smokehouse and whatever coffee was left in the pot. The whole thing cost almost nothing and took less than 10 minutes. On the frontier, time was food. Every minute spent cooking was a minute not spent riding. Redeye gravy respected that. It was fast, it was hot, it used ingredients already in the wagon, and it tasted like home for men who hadn't seen home in months. That was worth more than the pennies it cost. Number 16, vinegar pie. When there were no lemons, no apples, and no berries within 500 miles, frontier cooks used apple cider vinegar to make a pie that tasted tart and sweet at the same time. The filling was vinegar, sugar, eggs, butter, and a splash of water, baked in a simple crust made from flour and lard. It sounds wrong. It doesn't matter. It tasted right. The vinegar mimicked the tartness of fruit so well that cowboys who ate it couldn't tell the difference on a dark night by a campfire. Black homesteaders in Kansas, the exodusters who left the South after Reconstruction, made vinegar pie in sod houses on the open prairie because fruit did not grow on the plains and shipping it and cost more than a week of wages. A whole pie cost less than 15 cents to make. It fed a family of 4. It used pantry staples that lasted through winter. Vinegar pie was the lie that told the truth. It pretended to be something it was not, and nobody complained. Number 15, pemmican. This was not a cowboy invention. It belonged to the Plains Indians who had been making it for centuries. Before the first cattle drive, dried buffalo meat pounded into powder, mixed with render fat and crushed wild berries, then packed into rawhide pouches. A single pound contained enough calories to sustain a man through a full day of hard labor. Black Seminole scouts stationed along the Texas border learned to make pemmican from the Comanche and Kickapoo people they tracked alongside. These were men of mixed African, Native American, and Seminole descent who served the United States Army as frontier trackers. 4 of them received the Congressional Medal of Honor. They ate pemmican on long reconnaissance missions when carrying a cook fire would have given away their position. The knowledge passed between cultures the way survival always does, not through books, but through necessity. A black scout watching a Comanche woman prepare pemmican did not see a foreign food. He saw a familiar principle: use everything, waste nothing. Number 14, chili con carne. In San Antonio in the 1870s, Mexican women set up tables in the plazas after dark and sold bowls of chili to cowboys, soldiers, and laborers for a nickel. They were called the chili queens, and their recipe was simple: dried chili peppers, beef or goat, cumin, garlic, and water, simmered in iron pots until the meat fell apart and the broth turned the color of dark clay. Black cowboys passing through San Antonio on their way north picked up the taste and carried it up the trail. Within a decade, chili pots appeared on chuck wagons from Texas to Montana. The cumin that defined the flavor traced back to Spanish colonists from the Canary Islands who settled in San Antonio in the 1730s. Many of those colonists were of Moroccan descent and brought Berber cooking traditions with them. So the chili that a black cowboy ate on the plains of Kansas in 1882 contained the flavors of North Africa, Spain, Mexico, and the American South all in one pot. Here's what that means. The frontier was not one culture, it was dozens colliding in cookpots and skillets and Dutch ovens across 1,000 miles of grassland. Black cowboys didn't cook in isolation. They borrowed from Mexican vaqueros who had been working cattle in Texas for 200 years before the first Anglo rancher arrived. They borrowed from native communities who knew the land and what it offered. They borrowed from their own mothers and grandmothers who had cooked under the worst conditions imaginable and still put food on the table. The American frontier was built on borrowed recipes. Every meal was a collaboration, even when the people sharing the fire did not share the same rights. That pot of chili held more history than most textbooks, and it cost 5 cents. Number 13, jackrabbit stew. When the beef ran out and the supply wagon was 3 days behind, cowboys hunted what was in front of them. Jackrabbits covered the western plains in numbers that seemed impossible. A man with a steady hand and a rifle could bag 3 in an hour without leaving camp. Black cowboys skinned the rabbits, cut the meat into chunks, and dropped it into a pot with wild onions, water, and whatever dried herbs the cook had left. The meat was dark and tough and needed hours of simmering before it became tender. But after 3 hours in a Dutch oven, jackrabbit stew tasted like something a grandmother might have made if that grandmother lived on the open prairie with nothing but grass and sky for company. Jackrabbit was free. It required no supply chain, no money, and no trip to town. It was the frontier answering the question every poor man has asked since the beginning of time. What do I eat when there isn't anything left to eat? Number 12, molasses and cornbread. Cowboys called molasses lick, and it showed up on every chuck wagon between Texas and Dodge City. A tin of Blackstrap molasses cost a dime and lasted for weeks. You poured it over a slab of cornbread cooked in a cast iron skillet, and you had a meal that gave you enough energy to ride from sunup to midnight. Black cowboys knew molasses from before the frontier. It was the sweetener of the poor, the only sugar product that enslaved people were allowed to have in quantity because the refined white sugar went to the enslaver's table. The molasses went to the quarters. That history followed it west. When a black trail cook poured molasses over cornbread at a campfire in Indian territory, he was repeating a gesture that was older than the cattle industry itself. The bread was golden and gritty and smelled like home. The molasses was dark and thick and impossibly sweet. Together, they were a meal that cost less than a nickel and carried the weight of generations. Number 11, bacon, grease, gravy. Nothing on the chuck wagon went to waste, and nothing was more valuable than the tin can where the cook saved his bacon drippings. When it was time to make gravy, he scooped out a few spoonfuls of that grease, heated it in a skillet, sprinkled in flour, and stirred until the mixture turned golden brown. Then he added water, slowly, stirring the whole time until the gravy thickened into something that could turn a dry biscuit into a proper meal. Black cowboys called this poor man gravy, though that name traveled across every color line on the frontier. It had no meat in it. It had no milk. It was fat, flour, and water stretched across a plate to give the illusion of abundance. But illusion or not, it worked. A plate of biscuits drowned in bacon grease gravy kept a man satisfied until noon. The grease carried the ghost of every piece of bacon that had been fried in that skillet for the last 3 months, You weren't just eating gravy, you were eating history, one spoonful at a time. Number 10, prairie chicken. Before the cattle trails were fenced and the grasslands were plowed, prairie chickens were so thick on the plains that a man could hear them drumming from a mile away during mating season. Black cowboys shot them with rifles or caught them with snares made from horsehair. The birds were dark meat, gamey, and rich, somewhere between a pheasant and a small turkey. Trail cooks roasted them on a spit over the campfire, or cut them into pieces and braised them in a Dutch oven with water and dried onions until the meat fell off the bone. A single bird fed 2 men. A flock of 6 fed the whole crew. There wasn't any cost at all. The Prairie offered them up like a gift. Buffalo soldiers at Fort Concho in West Texas supplemented their monotonous army rations with prairie chickens hunted on patrol. The meat was a welcome break from the endless cycle of hardtack and salt pork. By 1900, the birds were nearly gone. The frontier ate them faster than the land could replace them. Number 9, frijoles. On the Texas border, black cowboys worked alongside Mexican vaqueros who had been herding cattle for 2 centuries. The vaqueros cooked pinto beans in clay pots with lard, garlic, and dried chili peppers until the beans turned creamy and the broth thickened into something that tasted like the earth itself. Black cowboys learned to make frijoles the same way, mashing some of the beans against the side of the pot to thicken the whole batch, adding a piece of salt pork for smokiness. A 5-pound sack of dried pinto beans cost 20 cents in the 1870s and fed a crew of 10 for 3 days. The beans traveled well. They weighed almost nothing dry, and unlike fresh meat, they did not spoil in the Texas heat. Here is something worth sitting with. The black cowboys who learned to cook frijoles from Mexican vaqueros were not just picking up a recipe. They were participating in something that had been happening on this continent for thousands of years. Corn, beans, and squash were the 3 sisters of indigenous agriculture long before any Europeans set foot on this land. Mexican vaqueros inherited that tradition from their own indigenous ancestors. And black cowboys, many of them born into slavery on Texas plantations, added their own knowledge of stretching food, seasoning scraps, and turning poverty ingredients into meals that sustain the body and something harder to name. Call it dignity, call it culture, call it the refusal to eat without intention. Whatever you call it, it was happening around campfires on the Llano Estacado in 1878, where men who owned almost nothing shared beans from the same pot and did not care who had cooked them. A bowl of frijoles on the frontier was not just food, it was proof that survival has no single author. Number 8, dried apple pie. Fresh fruit didn't exist on the cattle trail, but dried apples, packed in cotton sacks and stored in the chuck wagon, lasted for months without spoiling. The cook soaked the apple rings in water overnight until they softened, then cooked them down with sugar and a dash of cinnamon into a filling that he poured into a crust made from flour, lard, and water. The pie baked in a Dutch oven with coals piled on the lid and underneath. The result was rough and uneven and nothing like what a bakery would produce. But to a black cowboy who had been eating beans and hardtack for 6 weeks straight, that pie tasted like civilization. Dried apples cost about 15 cents a pound in the 1880s. A single pound made 2 pies. The cook who made dried apple pie on the trail was not just feeding men. He was reminding them that sweetness still existed, that somewhere beyond the dust and the cattle and the endless grass, there was still a world worth riding back to. Number 7, salt pork and potatoes. When a chuck wagon was fully stocked, it carried a barrel of salt pork and a sack of potatoes that together could feed a crew for weeks. The cook sliced the pork thin, soaked it in water to pull out enough salt to make it edible, then fried it in its own fat. The potatoes were peeled, diced, and fried in the leftover grease until they turned golden and crisp at the edges. That was supper. No seasoning beyond salt, no vegetables beyond the potato, no variation beyond whether the cook felt like dicing the pork or leaving it in slabs. Black homesteaders in Nicodemus, Kansas, the oldest surviving black settlement west of the Mississippi, ate this same meal through their first winter in 1878 when the crops failed and the supply trains didn't come. Salt pork and potatoes kept that community alive until spring. It was not a good meal, but it was a meal. And on the frontier, that distinction was the only one that mattered. Number 6, sourdough biscuits. The sourdough starter was the most valuable thing on the chuck wagon. More valuable than the flour, more valuable than the coffee. The cook kept it alive in a clay crock, feeding it with flour and water every day, carrying it wrapped in blankets on cold nights so the yeast wouldn't die. A good starter lasted for years, passed from one cook to the next like an inheritance. Black trail cooks mixed the starter with flour, salt, and a little lard, shaped the dough into rounds, and baked them in a Dutch oven until they rose golden and steaming. Sourdough biscuits were the bread of the frontier, eaten at every meal, used to sop up gravy, torn apart and dropped into stew. The tangy flavor came from wild yeast captured from the air. Every region produced a different taste depending on what floated in the wings. Your biscuit in Texas tasted different from your biscuit in Montana. The frontier flavored its own bread. Number 5, Beanhole beans. When a trail cook had time and the herd was settled for the night, he dug a hole in the ground about 2 feet deep, lined it with stones, and built a fire inside until the stones glowed red. Then he lowered a cast iron Dutch oven filled with soaked beans, salt pork, molasses, and an onion into that hole. He covered it with dirt and let it cook underground all night. By morning, the beans had turned into something so soft and deeply flavored that cowboys lined up before the sun was fully over the horizon. The sealed pot kept every drop of moisture trapped inside. The method came from New England baked beans, but black cooks on the Texas trails added their own mark: more molasses, a heavier hand with the pork, and sometimes a dried chili pepper for heat. A pot of Beanhole beans cost less than 20 cents and fed an entire crew. The earth itself was the oven. That was frontier engineering at its finest. Number 4, skillet cornbread. A black cowboy's cast iron skillet was seasoned by years of use, and cornbread baked in that skillet carried the flavor of every meal that had come before it. Cornmeal, water or buttermilk if you had it, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of bacon grease, mixed together and poured into a screaming hot skillet greased with lard. It baked over the campfire with a lid of coals on top until the edges turned dark brown and the center stayed golden and moist. The bread came out in a single round that you cut into wedges or broke apart with your hands. Black cowboys from East Texas and Louisiana added a pinch of sugar to their cornbread, a tradition that traced straight back to West Africa, where sweet corn preparations had existed for generations before the first slave ship crossed the Atlantic. That pinch of sugar wasn't just flavor, it was memory. It was a grandmother's hand reaching across an ocean and a century and 1,000 miles of open range to say, this is how we do it. This is who you are. Number 3, ash cakes. Before there were skillets, before there were Dutch ovens, there were ashes. Enslaved people in the American South made bread by wrapping cornmeal dough in wet leaves and burying it directly in the hot ashes of a fire. The leaves kept the ash off the bread while the heat baked it through. It was the oldest form of bread on the continent, borrowed from Native American cooking and adapted by people who had no pans, no ovens, and no choice. Black cowboys made ash cakes on nights when the chuck wagon was miles behind, and all they had was a campfire, a handful of cornmeal, and whatever leaves they could find. The bread came out smoky and dense with a charred crust that tasted like the fire itself. Nat Love, the black cowboy who became famous as Deadwood Dick, described eating ash cakes on the trail in his 1907 autobiography. He didn't call them a delicacy, he called them what they were, the food of men who had nothing and made it work anyway. Number 2, Blackstrap molasses water. When there was no food at all, there was this, a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into a tin cup of water. That was the entire recipe. Black cowboys drank it on long night watches when the cook had already packed the wagon and the next meal was 12 hours away. Blackstrap molasses was the cheapest sweetener on the frontier, the final byproduct of sugar refining, so dark and bitter that plantation owners considered it fit only for livestock and enslaved people. But it was dense with iron, calcium, and potassium. A single tablespoon contained more iron than a serving of spinach. Men who drank molasses water regularly didn't know they were preventing anemia. They just knew it kept them standing. A tin of blackstrap cost 8 cents and lasted a month. For a man earning $1 a day, that was nothing. For a man earning nothing, which described more than a few black cowboys who worked for room and board alone, it was everything. Survival distilled into a single dark spoonful. Number 1, bone broth. When the beef was eaten, the jerky was gone, and the beans were down to dust at the bottom of the sack. The cook reached for the bones. Cattle bones, cracked open to expose the marrow, dropped into a pot of water and simmered for hours until the broth turned rich and golden and thick enough to coat a spoon. That was the last meal, the meal you made when there was truly nothing else. Black cowboys knew this the way their grandmothers knew it, because on the plantation, bones were what you got. The enslaver kept the roasts and the chops. The bones went to the people who did the work, and those people turned bones into broth that was more nourishing than most of the food on the enslaver's table. A pot of bone broth cost nothing. The bones were waste. The water was free. The fire was already burning. This wasn't a recipe. This was the final act of refusal. The refusal to go hungry when the world gave you nothing but bones.
Smothered breakfast potatoes were the Skillet hero of 1960s mornings, a dish that stretched a handful of ingredients into something big enough to feed everyone. Mothers sliced the potatoes thin, letting them hit the hot grease before adding onions, peppers, salt, and a little black pepper for heat. The skillet hissed, the house filled with the scent of frying potatoes, and sleepy children wandered into the kitchen even before they were called. The potatoes softened and browned, edges crisping, onions turning sweet, and the peppers melting into the mix. This was a breakfast you could eat alone or beside eggs, biscuits, or sausage, and it never disappointed. Mothers loved it because it was dependable and cheap. Children loved it because it tasted like comfort, disguised as something simple. A plate of smothered potatoes could fuel a child until lunch, carrying them through long mornings at school or long walks down dusty roads. Over the years, frozen hash browns and faster options took its place, but nothing compares to the taste of potatoes cooked slow in a cast-iron skillet by a mother who knew exactly when to turn them. For those who remember, one spoonful brings back the sound of sizzling grease and the warmth of a kitchen where breakfast meant love made visible.
Field pea hash was a hearty skillet meal that turned leftover peas and whatever vegetables remained into breakfast that carried a family through a full day of labor. Black families mashed cooked field peas with diced onions, potatoes, and sometimes leftover meat scraps, then fried the mixture in pork fat until a crispy crust formed on the bottom. The hash was served hot, often topped with a fried egg, creating a complete meal from ingredients that cost almost nothing. Field peas grew abundantly in southern soil, required little care, and dried easily for winter storage, making them a reliable staple in Black gardens. The hash made use of peas cooked days earlier, ensuring nothing spoiled or went to waste. Mothers taught daughters to press the hash firmly against the skillet, creating the crispy bottom that made each serving satisfying.
Homemade buttermilk pancakes were the tall, fluffy stacks that made children race to the table before the first one even left the skillet. Mothers whisked the batter by hand, pouring it onto cast iron where bubbles rose through the surface like tiny promises. The pancakes cooked into thick, tender rounds, soft enough to soak up syrup but sturdy enough to hold butter melting across the top. Kids begged for extra because no two pancakes ever tasted exactly the same, and every batch felt like a gift made fresh. These pancakes beat diner versions every time because they tasted like home, like effort, like the quiet rhythm of a mother working before sunrise. Sometimes she added a little cinnamon, sometimes a splash more buttermilk, sometimes she cut them into halves for the younger ones. Each plate carried the same intention: fill their stomachs, start their day right, send them into the world with something warm inside. Pancake mornings were special, even when they were simple, and children looked forward to them more than anything in a box. As mixes and frozen pancakes took over kitchens, the homemade version faded, but anyone who remembers them can still taste the difference. Real batter, real heat, real love poured into every round.
Potlikker with cornbread was the liquid gold that nourished Black families when nothing else remained in the pantry. After collard greens or turnip greens simmered for hours with salt pork, the cooking liquid transformed into a nutrient-rich broth that families refused to waste. This greenish-brown liquid held vitamins and the essence of everything cooked in it, far more valuable than water alone. Families ladled warm potlikker into bowls and crumbled day-old cornbread directly into the liquid, creating a filling meal from what others poured down the drain. Children grew up sipping potlikker as medicine and comfort, knowing this humble broth represented their family's ability to stretch every ingredient. The tradition passed through generations, each understanding that throwing away potlikker meant throwing away sustenance itself.
Chocolate gravy over biscuits was the rare, magical breakfast that felt like a holiday, even on an ordinary morning. Mothers cooked cocoa, sugar, butter, and milk into a glossy gravy that poured hot over fresh biscuits. Children begged for it because it tasted like dessert disguised as breakfast, warm and sweet with a hint of chocolate that felt indulgent and unforgettable. It was not an everyday dish, just a sometimes treat, but those mornings became memories children still talk about decades later. The whole house lit up when someone whispered that chocolate gravy was coming, because everyone knew it meant the day was starting with joy instead of hurry. Mothers whisked the pot with careful hands to keep lumps from forming, and the smell drifted down hallways, pulling sleepy children to the kitchen before they were fully awake. The biscuits soaked up the gravy until they were soft enough to eat with a spoon, turning each bite into something warm enough to chase away cold mornings, and long after the plates were empty, the sweetness lingered, on tongues, in the air, and in the memory of a morning that felt like a gift.
Poke salat was foraged food that grew wild along fence rows and untended fields, free for the taking when store-bought vegetables were beyond reach. Black families gathered young, pokeweed shoots in early spring, knowing that proper preparation was essential since the mature plant was poisonous. The leaves were boiled in multiple changes of water to remove toxins, then sautéed with onions and bacon grease until tender. This dish required knowledge passed through generations, teaching children which plants to pick, when to harvest, and how to cook them safely. Poke salat represented the connection between Black communities and the land, even when they owned none of it. The bitter greens provided vitamins desperately needed after long winters of preserved foods. Families who knew how to find and cook poke salat never went hungry come spring.
molasses or cane syrup on toast was the simple sweet breakfast that got countless 1960s children out the door with something in their stomachs. Mothers spread the thick, dark syrup across warm toast until it soaked in and dripped at the edges. It was cheap, fast, and full of flavor, a treat that felt bigger than it really was. Kids licked their fingers, wiped their plates, and asked for seconds whenever they could. This breakfast was born from thrift, but it tasted like love and familiarity, not sacrifice. Sometimes mothers warmed the syrup slightly so it softened and flowed into every corner of the bread, turning each bite into something almost candy-like. For children who rarely had store-bought treats, this toast felt like a small miracle on a weekday morning. The smell of the syrup warming on the stove lingered through the house, mixing with the sound of school shoes being tied and doors opening to the cool morning air. It was quick, but never rushed, because everyone stopped for at least a moment to taste that sweetness before the day began.
Streakoline was the poor man's bacon, a cheap cut of pork belly with thin streaks of meat running through solid fat that cost pennies when proper bacon was beyond reach. Black families fried these thin slices until the fat rendered and meat crisped, creating a breakfast staple that filled bellies and provided energy for grueling workdays. The rendered fat was saved for cooking vegetables, frying eggs, or seasoning beans, making every slice work double duty. This cut appeared at breakfast tables across the South, sizzling in cast iron alongside eggs and grits, filling kitchens with the smell of pork. Though wealthier families looked down on this fatty cut, Black households understood its value. The fat provided essential calories during scarcity, and the small amount of meat satisfied cravings when ham was unaffordable.
Sausage patties made from scratch were the heartiest part of many 1960s Black breakfasts, the kind of food that made a child feel ready to take on anything the school day threw at them. Mothers seasoned the meat by hand with salt, pepper, sage, and whatever spices their own mothers had taught them to use. They shaped the patties carefully and laid them in the skillet where they sizzled, browned, and filled the house with a smell that pulled children straight into the kitchen. These patties were crisp on the outside, juicy inside, and full of flavor you could not find in store-bought sausage. Kids sandwiched them in biscuits, crumbled them into grits, or ate them plain with their fingers when they were too hungry to wait for a fork. For mothers, making sausage from scratch was a way to stretch ingredients and control the flavor. For children, it was the taste of a real breakfast. As packaged sausage became easier to buy, homemade patties faded from daily life. But anyone who grew up eating them knows nothing beats the sound of sausage frying in a cast-iron skillet early in the morning.
Red bean porridge was a humble bowl of sustenance that stretched a handful of dried beans into meals for an entire week. Black families soaked red beans overnight, then simmered them slowly with onion and garlic until the beans broke down into thick, creamy mush. The porridge was served hot over rice or with cornbread, providing complete protein that rivaled expensive meat. This dish traced its roots to West African cooking traditions, where beans and grains formed the foundation of daily meals. During the Depression, red bean porridge kept children fed when grocery money ran short. Mothers added a small piece of salt pork when possible, stretching the meat's flavor through the entire batch. The porridge could be reheated for days, growing thicker and more flavorful with each warming.
Fried cornbread patties made from hot water bread were the quick, crispy breakfast that came together in minutes, perfect for busy mothers who needed to feed many children before the day rushed in. Flour and cornmeal met boiling water until the mixture thickened into a dough that could be shaped right in the palm. The patties hit the skillet with a sizzle, frying in a thin layer of oil or bacon grease until the edges crisped and the centers stayed soft. Kids loved the sound as much as the taste. They begged for them with butter, with jelly, with a drizzle of cane syrup, or just plain hot from the skillet. These patties were the kind of food that taught children to appreciate texture. Crisp outside, tender inside, warm all the way through. Mothers made them without measuring because the recipe lived in their fingers, and every batch tasted slightly different depending on how much water or meal went in. Fried cornbread patties were fast, reliable, and comforting, the kind of breakfast that made sure no child walked out the door hungry. Even when grocery shelves brought new kinds of bread and packaged mixes, nothing matched the flavor of these simple patties eaten at the kitchen table while the morning light crept in. They tasted like survival, love, and tradition, all pressed into a single handful. Today, many children have never seen them cooked, but those who remember can still taste that first bite. The warmth, the crunch, the feeling of being cared for before the day even started.
Here is my challenge. Pick one of these meals and make it this week. The sourdough biscuits, the skillet cornbread, the frijoles with a piece of salt pork. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place. Eat it slow, because these meals were not just about being poor, they were about staying alive and staying human when the trail was 2,000 miles long and the pay was $30 a month, and the world did not care whether a black man on a horse ate supper or went hungry. 1 in 4 cowboys was black. They rode the same trails, worked the same cattle, and ate from the same pot. But their names did not make it into the movies. Their recipes did not make it into the cookbooks. Their stories sat in the dust for 150 years. Share which one you're going to make in the comments. I want to know if the chili con carne gets more love than the Beanhole beans. I want to know if anyone else heard stories about cowboys and their family that nobody bothered to write down, because these are not just frontier meals. They are proof that the simplest food cooked over an open fire and eaten under the stars can still be an act of dignity.